My name's Avi Savar. I am the president of Suzy. I'm also a partner at venture capital firm DreamIt. And I'm going to talk today a little bit about assumptions and why assumptions, at least from my perspective, are one of the most destructive forces in business today, especially as the world continues to move faster and faster and faster. And the decisions we make happen in real time. The need for kind of gut checking and validating our assumptions is one of the most important parts of our jobs on a day-to-day basis. So I thought I'd start by just laying the land a little bit, setting the stage in terms of the backdrop of where business is headed, and then talk a little bit about what assumptions actually are and how they're broken up. Show you some examples of some of the worst assumptions I've ever seen, and then get into a little bit about how we're thinking about tackling assumptions and show you some of the work. So let's kick it off here. So this shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody, but obviously the pace of disruption has just exploded. The velocity of innovation over the last century, certainly over the last couple decades, has taken us by storm, right? And it's all first and foremost grounded by evolution of computing power, right? Computers used to take up rooms probably this size, maybe not quite this size. But today, the size of that computer now is in our pockets. And microprocessors, computing power, cloud computing, this has all pretty much democratized the business landscape to allow for new innovations to come into our world, into our lives at a clip that we've never seen before. I love this quote. I put this on the slide because it illustrates the fact that disruption comes, and ultimately the forces of disruption today, right, are creating a perfect scenario for businesses to either explode in value or completely disappear. And we are seeing that starting to happen. Certainly the explosion of companies coming into our world has taken the markets, both public and private, by storm. And this chart kind of illustrates, certainly over the last 4 years, you can see the cluster of startups that have come into our world. And these are only the ones that are worth $1 billion or more. These are unicorns, right? And you can just see that like the clustering of these companies and how many there are has created a new world order, right? And this is super interesting because when you start to look at what that's done to public markets, certainly, right? Over the last 20 years, half the S&P 500 has disappeared. Half the S&P 500 doesn't exist, right, from 20 years ago. And the average lifespan of a company in the S&P 500 has dropped from just under 70 years, 67 years, to less than 15. So these titans of industry, these companies that have established themselves as the kind of the roots of business, are now kind of relegated to the lifespan of like a golden retriever, right? I mean, it's kind of funny to think about it, but when you look at this, it creates a level playing field for lots of different types of companies. And as a business owner or an executive or a CEO, this kind of chart would scare the crap out of me, right? Because it shows me that everybody in this world, every company, every organization, across every vertical, right, is in the crosshairs for potential disruption. If you kind of zoom in to a certain subset, I could actually argue that pretty much almost all of them fall into this paradigm, but I'm going to show an illustrative example of just a few. Most of these companies that are creating this level of disruption, right, they're typically technology-led, right? I mean, you remember the microprocessing chart earlier just showed the pace of innovation from a technological standpoint. So most of these companies are, in fact, technology-driven. But the thing that also unites them, the thing that technology inevitably does, right, is it connects people. It creates efficiencies, but it also connects people. And therefore, these companies are all students of consumers. Game mechanics, social dynamics, right? Network effects. These are all new phrases that have entered our world over the last decade or so and are being pioneered by these types of companies, right? So these all understand what consumers need, what they want, and they're trying to innovate accordingly. The fact is, disruption can be broken down by about 5 different categories in terms of their genesis and what kind of causes disruption. And if you look at this, this is a pulse survey done by PricewaterhouseCoopers, interviewing or asking about a little less than 300 CEOs, what keeps them up at night? What is the key factor in disruption? And 71% said consumers, customers, their customers, the changing behaviors and buying habits of customers is impacting their business even more so than competition, right? And that's amazing to think about. Of course, distribution, production, regulation, all that stuff is a factor as well. But customers is the primary source of change in business. And it's also causing folks to get fired left and right because they don't quite understand where customer behavior is going. They don't see the writing on the wall. They're assuming that the things that they've been doing for decades are still relevant today. They're assuming that the decisions that they're making are still right for where we are today. And the fact is we're moving faster and faster and faster, and they're not. Not only are people getting fired, but businesses are disappearing, right? This shouldn't surprise anybody here. I mean, Toys R Us a few months ago, coming out, basically being done. This was a company that I grew up with, right? I remember the excitement that I used to have walking into that store. It didn't surprise me when all those stores are closed and the entire business is gone, and Jeffrey the giraffe is no longer with us. May he rest in peace. So these stories are coming out weekly. I mean, this is one that I saw a couple weeks ago that I had to show because it illustrated very nicely the point I'm trying to make. And this is from, so this gentleman, Jorge Limon, is one of the founders, if not the founder of 3G Capital. 3G Capital is one of the largest private equity funds or firms around. They own Anheuser-Busch InBev, among other brands. And a couple weeks ago, or about a month ago or so, I came across this a couple weeks ago. About a month ago, he was quoted by saying, you know, the craft beer frenzy took us by surprise because they didn't quite understand the behavioral changes in young drinking habits. And you look at the data, right? You look at this chart over the last 10 years, or certainly, you know, since 2003 and beyond, you can see how craft beer has started to penetrate the market. And if I'm this guy, how am I not seeing this, right? How am I not understanding where the world is going? Why? Because I've got the curse of knowledge, I've got the blinders on, I live in my own bubble, and I'm not understanding where the world is going. And he went so far as to call himself a dinosaur. It's pretty funny. So the reality is assumptions, right, led to a lot of these mishaps, a lot of these big implosions in business are all correlated back to certain assumptions that were made and certain assumptions that effectively led to these catastrophes. And when you talk about assumptions, right, when you think about what assumptions are all about, you know, I've spent the last few years as a partner at a venture capital firm, and with that, I've come to realize that assumptions is actually what creates value, right? Once you validate them. If I have an assumption that this business is going to be amazing, or that people are going to want my product, that's just my opinion. When I actually go out in the world and I validate the fact that people do want what I'm selling, at that point I've created value and investors are willing to put money behind me, right? So the more assumptions I validate, the more value I create. So let's talk about assumptions for right now. Assumptions in business are equivalent to risk, right? When you assume, you take risks. And once you validate your assumptions, those risks come off the table, right? And then value gets created. There are two types of assumptions in business, kind of simplifying it for the purposes of this talk. There's technical risk, right? And there's market risk. I'm going to talk a little bit about both for a few minutes. Technical risk, can this thing get built? Can we actually make what we say we want to make, right? How long is it going to take us to do it? Right? Will it scale? Is there anything proprietary about what it is that we're building or what it is that we're doing? Right? Any regulatory or legal concerns about how we're doing it? Right? Most of us recently read about, you know, legislation that got broken down as it relates to online gambling, and companies like FanDuel, right, are like now, wow, going out and raising a couple $100 million to take advantage of it, right? So that risk is now off the table, and they can come full force into the market. What kind of resources am I going to need? Will I actually have the money and the budget to make this happen, right? So from a technical standpoint, as soon as you start taking some of these off the table and those check boxes get checked, value creation starts to happen. So let's talk for now about market risk, which is, you know, we're mostly marketers in this room, right? So I want to talk more about market risks than technical risks because it's what we do on a day-to-day basis. We wake up in the morning, we try to figure out how to navigate our brands, how to help our clients, right? And build valuable big brands in the marketplace, tell compelling stories, meet people's demands. And so when you look at market risks from a business standpoint, these are some of the things that you start to think about, right? How compelling is this thing that we're putting out there, right? How are we going to talk about it, right? What are the messaging points that we're going to use, right, that will resonate with our target customer, right? How big is this market, right? Is this actually something worth doing? Is it worthwhile? Do enough people need this thing that it's worthwhile to even spend our time doing it? Right? Will it fit within this customer or consumer's lifestyle? Will they actually accept it? Will they embrace it into their lives? Right? And what kind of messaging we'll use? All that stuff relates to market risk. In terms of people's needs and how you start to validate some of these risks, we start to look at, okay, well, let's look at people and let's understand kind of where they're coming from and how our products, our services, and the value that we create fall into their lives, right? Are we helping them with their time? Are we saving time? Are we helping them be more efficient? Are we solving some core fear that they have? Are we helping them adjust to a lifestyle need or demand, right? Are we taking pain or discomfort out of their day-to-day, their week-to-week? Are we creating efficiencies? So the more we can start to validate these assumptions around what value we're creating, our businesses thrive. I like to show this because it very quickly illustrates, like, we always talk about we want to be must-have, right? And how do we ultimately deliver valuable products, services, messaging to resonate with our consumers on a day-to-day basis. And I use this example because it makes a lot of sense to me, right? The nice to have is the daily vitamin. Maybe I take it, maybe I don't. If I don't take it, it's really not that big of a deal. I should, but right? When I have a headache or if I'm hungover, that aspirin, oh boy, do I need it, right? Well, can I get through my day without it? Probably. I might feel like crap, but I'm not stopping from my existence because I have a headache or a hangover. That being said, when I'm sick or I have an infection, if I don't have access to that medicine, then there's a problem, right? And so on that continuum, on that spectrum of nice to have, need to have, must have, how do you use those to gut check what it is that we're putting into the world on a day-to-day basis, and how do we validate whether or not the things that we're creating are in fact must have or need to have or maybe nice to have. And the world is not like Field of Dreams, because there's a lot of products and services that get built that should never have been. There are a lot of things that people create that they feel are the greatest things since sliced bread, and they fall on deaf ears. And the reality is we spend time, money, resources, and effort to build things that we think people want. Do they actually want them? Who the hell knows, right? So how do we actually get ahead of that and begin to validate our theories? How about this one? I love this. I'm going to show you a bunch of products that fell on deaf ears. Harley Davidson making not a cologne, but an eau de toilette, right? Okay, I don't know, doesn't feel right to me, but somebody thought this was a good idea. Colgate selling food. This actually happened, people, right? Walking down the aisles, would you buy a chicken dinner from Colgate? Colgate's a trusted brand, right? One of the best in the business in the world, globally recognized, right? Creating immense value. But there's a massive, at least for me, a disconnect here, right? So somebody thought this was a good idea. I'm sure it was tested to some degree, but ultimately it did not resonate. I love this one. Oh boy. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall in this meeting when Cheetos thought it was brilliant to come up with lip balm. I wanted to be in that meeting. I cannot even imagine anybody thinking that this was a good idea, but somebody did, right? Because everybody wants it. Lifesavers and fruit punch. I don't know. My kid probably would drink it, but I would never let her, right? Watermelon Oreos. Right? Smith & Wesson bicycles. I bet they're pretty rugged and resilient. But so you look at these products, right? These are actually products that happened, in some bubble somewhere. I never saw them in market, but in researching this talk and this presentation, I was shocked to see some of these. And believe me, there was about 20 others that were on the cutting room floor that didn't make it into the presentation because I only have 25 minutes. But I wanted to show them because I don't think any of these are going to ultimately play in the world. So I wish them well. I wish them good luck. And I hope to God that I don't ever see them in the aisles. But with that, right, I start to think about, all right, these are products. Now let's talk about messaging for a second, right? Because a lot of us, I said earlier in this audience, are about creating messaging and compelling moments in time and figuring out how to resonate with consumers. So let's talk about messaging and some of the assumptions that have been made over the last few years. How about Adidas wishing, this was last year, congratulations, you survived the Boston Marathon. This went out in social, it went out via email. It also caused massive apologies to happen moments later, right? Somebody just didn't think, right? This wasn't like, had something not happened a year prior, this would have been a perfectly acceptable post or tweet. But the context wasn't there. Somebody living in a bubble, gut checking nowhere, thought this was a great idea. I'm just gonna let this one sit for a minute. I'm just gonna let this one sit, soak it in, okay? Yeah, right. I mean, she might as well have been wearing a cloak. I think this is insane. I mean, completely asinine, right? Like, somebody had to have gotten fired. So sink this one in too. Yeah, this was 2016, I believe. Spike your best friend's eggnog when they're not looking. Oh, crazy to think about. Yeah. The perfect beer for removing no from your vocabulary for the night. Yep. Yeah, because I guess no, I don't know. No means no. And somebody thought this was a good idea. And somebody at a very large brand, right? One of the largest. So we're all flawed. We all have our moments of weakness, right? We come up with ideas all the time. We're in the business of ideas. And when you get caught up in the moment and you start thinking about it from the lens of your own perspective, right? It's easy to just let it all go. But how do you validate? How do you start to understand that like every decision you make impacts, and there are many, many bubbles out there that exist. And as marketers, as business owners, as creators of value, of products and services, it is our responsibility to penetrate multiple bubbles, right? We got to get in front of lots of people. And the number of brands that have to apologize every day is skyrocketing, right? We see it all the time. This is another one. Right? I don't know if anybody has seen this show, The Man in the High Castle. It's an Amazon series. When it first launched, all around New York City, subways in Nazi propaganda decoration. So these seats on the other side were, Nazi designs, and people were livid. I mean, livid to walk into a subway and see swastikas created an uprising. Right? And again, the show in and of itself is an amazing concept, and in theory, this is a brilliant campaign, but oh my God. So how many of these decisions do you think were made by hippos? Does anybody know what a hippo is? Highest paid person's opinion. Yeah, right? We've all been in these meetings, right? We've all sat in where we're showing our bosses what we think should happen, and ultimately it's going to come down to one person's decision, right? The highest paid person in the room is going to make a gut check call. And if you look at industries and businesses, almost 85% of decisions get made based on management judgment. Management judgment, right? Somebody somewhere thinks something is a good idea that makes it to market, and then here we are, apologizing, getting fired, companies going down in flames. I'm being dramatic for illustrative purposes, but I'm not that far off, right? We make judgment calls every single day. Millions of business decisions get made every single day based on assumptions that go unvalidated and untested. Why? Because we don't have access? So here we are. Assumptions get made every single day. The idea here is to hopefully get you guys to start thinking about how we validate assumptions and how you can validate your assumptions in real time, right? To observe the world, to ideate effectively, but before you go out into the world, to validate your theories and your theses. And then repeat the process until you've refined it to a point where you feel comfortable, confident to put it out into the world. And that's what we're trying to create at Suzy, a crystal ball that can help you begin to validate your assumptions in real time, right? Because market research is slow, market research is expensive, right? Market research is not something that you can immediately access, right? So that's what we're trying to figure out how to do, and that's what we're building, is instant on-demand validation, instant on-demand access to consumers. We've got a panel of over 1 million consumers that have opted into our technology, and we've created this human intelligence platform where brands can immediately access any customer segment and ask them any type of questions and get answers in real time. So I'm going to use the automotive industry as an illustrative example of how, right? How can you use on-demand insights to begin to validate assumptions and start to think about how to kind of see beyond the horizon and go into new markets, expand into new territories, develop new messaging that resonate. The automotive industry, I was actually going to use retail, but I thought that was too obvious and too cliche at this point because we've all kind of heard the news and we've all seen what's happened in the retail markets and industries. So I'm looking at automotive because that's on the cusp. It's about to get disrupted in a pretty profound way. And I think that there are massive opportunities for automotive companies to take advantage of consumer behavioral change, technological disruptions, and every part of the car is getting broken down, from the technology that enables it and runs it, right, all the way to the navigation systems that tell us where to go, to even the business models of ownership, right, and how we think about getting from point A to point B. So I don't need to go through the stats here about the disruption that's coming through automotive transformation, right? But billions of dollars are at stake, right? Billions of dollars are at stake. And there are a lot of car companies today that are leaning into it, and there are a lot of car companies today that are shying away from it, right? The question is, which one would you want to be? And so we've got a few on our platform that use it on a regular basis. And so I want to show you just a couple of ways that they're using it to really get, to get that crystal ball, get access to that crystal ball. So everything from just simple questions like, how do you manage your lifestyle in an autonomous environment? How is your commute impacted, right? These are simple questions that you just want to get feedback on a regular basis, right? But how about creating ongoing dialogue, right? Ongoing conversations with consumers, which you can't do through surveys, you can't do through interviews, because once you conduct a survey, those survey respondents are gone. You can't ever talk to them again. So the value and the real kind of exciting part of Suzy is the ability to retarget, right? The ability to ask questions, and then a month later, based on somebody's prior answer, go back and ask another question, right? So we've got, these are a bunch of, there was a car crash, autonomous car crash several months ago in Arizona, and this company targeted people who had already raised their hand and said they were interested and thought, autonomous vehicles was something they would be interested in. 2 months later, they were able to ask a question to those same exact people who said, yes, I'm psyched that this thing is happening. After this crash, they've targeted those people and asked them again. So you said you were interested in autonomous vehicles, and you read this article. What do you think now, right? And so you're able to benchmark over time how patterns and behaviors and consumers' sentiment shifts, right? Sure, you could look at social data, right? You could look at, listening data, but a lot of that is obviously historical. In my opinion, it also paints a picture of the world that people want, not that people actually are in, right? So I'm going to present in social the best version of myself, which may or may not be actual fact. So the idea of being able to benchmark and understand and communicate over time to your consumer, we believe is incredibly valuable. You can also start to think about business model innovation, right? Would you consider subscribing to a vehicle like you would a cell phone plan, right? And then from there, you take it a step further, and you begin to slice and dice that data. So not only do you understand business model impact on a broad consumer base, but you can start to go in and say, well, what about millennials versus boomers? Right? What about people in the Midwest versus people in the Northeast? Right? What about people who are married versus people who are single, right? And you begin to start to understand the behavioral impact of your business models, your products, your services, how you're pricing and how you're thinking about it from a census data perspective. The other thing that you can do, which a lot of our clients do on a regular basis, is screen. So this car company, one of our clients, keeps an open question on the platform at all times. Very simply put, what kind of car do you drive? So now they've begun to create segmented panels of every type of car driver that exists. So not only will they understand whether or not people are interested in new business models or new services as it relates to autonomous vehicles, but they can also understand who those people are beyond census data based on where they live, what they're doing, but also what car they drive, right? And so it begins to create a really unique opportunity for brands, right, for businesses to interact and understand from a human intelligence perspective how their businesses are getting impacted and how to validate the assumptions that they're making, because we make assumptions every day. We have to. It's what we do. We get paid to make assumptions, right? And over time, if we make better assumptions than most, we get promoted, right? But if we make assumptions that create chaos, and we wish Boston Marathon runners, speedy recovery, it just doesn't work. So how is it that we keep track on a day-to-day basis when the world is moving faster and faster and faster and faster, and decisions need to get made in real time? Suzy, hopefully, is the answer to that. So the idea of unlocking human intelligence from this perspective, and whether it's Suzy or any other kind of company, ultimately what I'm talking about is the ability to access human intelligence to discover new markets, to live in the moment, to stay relevant, right? Relevancy is our currency, right? If we're not relevant today, businesses are gone tomorrow, right? Reducing time to market, right? It takes much less time for businesses today to get to market than before because, again, technological advancements. But how do we speed up, right? We've all talked about agile innovation, right? So we need to work faster. We need to dig in to understand who those right audiences are and how we segment them so that we can ultimately de-risk our businesses. So my belief is that you have to validate everything. Every decision, small or large, needs some level of validation. And the idea is to convert your assumptions into knowledge in the fastest, most cost-effective way possible, right? How do you spend the least amount of cash money capital and the most amount of intellectual capital in order to validate your assumptions before you spend the money to go to market, right? And again, going back to that kind of VC analogy, that is how valuations happen, right? Series C, Series A, Series B, Series C, Series D, going public. At every one of those stages, assumptions have been taken out of the equation, and investors' confidence has increased, and more money comes into those companies based solely on the fact that they have validated assumptions, and market risk has been taken out of the business. Right? That's no different from anything that we're doing, whether you're a startup entrepreneur, whether you're a brand manager, whether you're an innovation director, a research or insights executive. This is what we need to do on a day-to-day basis, right? So that you know when to pivot, that you know what decisions to make, and most importantly, the decisions don't get made by a hippo, but they're actually made based on real thought and validation. Thank you very much. My name is Avi Savar. Apparently there is a AMA spot I'll be at after this talk. My colleague Emily and I will be there for any questions or any follow-ups that you might like. I appreciate the time. Thank you very much.